You are falling from a building with no roof, the ground rushing upward at a terrifying velocity. Or perhaps you are trapped in a room with a rising tide, or staring down the barrel of an unseen weapon. The tension reaches its absolute zenith. The fatal impact is less than a millisecond away. Your heart hammers against your ribs, your muscles lock, and just as the final blow connects, the universe shatters. You open your eyes. You are safe in your bed, staring at the familiar shadows on your bedroom ceiling, drawing a ragged breath. Every human being across every culture shares this bizarre, hard-coded biological boundary. No matter how vivid, terrifying, or immersive a nightmare becomes, you are almost never permitted to experience the moment after death. The dream engine always forces a hard reset just before the final transition occurs. We commonly attribute this to a standard evolutionary survival mechanism, assuming the brain simply panics and wakes up due to an excess of adrenaline. But what if this explanation is fundamentally backwards? What if you don't wake up because you are frightened? What if you wake up because the biological brain is incapable of rendering the next frame? Consider the haunting possibility that the dream space is a highly advanced virtual simulator, and your consciousness is forcibly ejected the exact moment you threaten to discover what lies beyond the code of your physical identity. Our relationship with the sleeping state is defined by a deep, unexamined complacency. We treat dreams as meaningless biological scrapbooks, a chaotic mental landfill where the brain sorts through the day's anxieties, random memories, and chemical waste. Yet, the moment you close your eyes, your mind constructs entirely functional worlds, complete with gravity, architecture, complex characters, and profound emotional depth. Your brain convinces you entirely that a fabrication is absolute reality. In this nocturnal state, you do not know you are lying in a dark room. You genuinely believe you are running, fighting, or flying. If the mind possesses the staggering power to perfectly simulate the intricate texture of life every single night, why does it suddenly hit a brick wall the moment it faces death? Why does an instrument capable of generating entire universes freeze, stutter, and abort the program at the exact threshold of the grave? When we analyze this boundary through the lens of audience psychology and informational architecture, the traditional scientific narrative begins to unravel. The standard materialist view suggests that because the brain has never actually experienced physical death, it lacks the memory data required to simulate the experience, forcing a sudden awakening. But this logic falls apart upon closer inspection. The dream engine routinely invents scenarios you have never experienced in waking life. You can dream of traveling to distant planets, shape-shifting into different creatures, or mastering languages you do not speak. The subconscious has no trouble fabricating impossible realities. Yet, when it comes to the singular event of cessation, the system refuses to speculate. It draws a definitive line in the sand. It is as if our consciousness hits a localized firewall, a cosmic copyright barrier that prevents the avatar from seeing past the edges of the current matrix. This realization introduces an intense psychological conflict into our understanding of human awareness. If the mind is a closed loop, it shouldn't have parameters it cannot cross. The presence of a firewall implies the presence of an architecture that was designed to keep us contained. Think of a video game character running toward the edge of a map. No matter how fast they run, they will eventually hit an invisible wall where the digital terrain simply ceases to load. The character cannot walk into the void because the game engine is only programmed to render the world within the boundaries of the play area. By forcing you to wake up the exact millisecond before you die, the architecture of the mind ensures that you remain strictly anchored to the physical perspective. It yanks you back into the waking world, recentering your antenna to the frequency of your daily identity before you can peek behind the curtain of the simulation. To understand how deep this mechanism goes, we must look at the profound relationship between the dreaming mind and the physical body. When you enter rapid eye movement sleep, your brain stem sends a chemical signal to paralyze your limbs, preventing you from physically acting out your nocturnal movements. Your body becomes a literal statue while your mind explores vast, non-local landscapes. Yet, during a death dream, the boundary between the two states becomes dangerously thin. The sheer psychological terror of the impending impact triggers a massive, systemic emergency response in your physical nervous system. The heart rate spikes, cortisol floods the bloodstream, and the brainwaves enter a state of high beta chaos. The dream does not end because it chooses to. It ends because the localized vehicle is about to suffer a genuine traumatic shock. The avatar's crisis threatens to break the biological machine, forcing the master override switch to flip. This structural boundary brings us to a radical re-evaluation of what we call waking reality. If our dreams are simulated environments that feel entirely real until we wake up, then the life you are living right now, the bills you pay, the identity you guard, the history you carry, operates under the exact same psychological parameters. You are completely convinced of the reality of this current frame because you are currently inside it. But just as the nightmare feels absolute until the very moment of the fall, this waking life may be a denser, slower iteration of the exact same phenomenon. The hard reset of the nightmare is a structural clue, a whisper from the deeper architecture of consciousness, reminding us that our localized perspective is entirely dependent on the preservation of the container. But if the dream engine is a closed matrix designed to keep the observer locked within the physical parameters of the self, we are left with a terrifying, unresolved philosophical question. If the hard reset always pulls us back to the safety of our bedroom just before the final impact, what would happen if the firewall failed? What would occur if your consciousness refused to wake up, crossed the threshold of the impact, and forced the mind to render the frame that comes after death? To confront this question, we must venture into the strange intersection where cognitive neuroscience intersects with the staggering implications of theoretical physics. If the mind is an antenna, we must look at what happens to the biological receiver when it faces the ultimate threat of destruction. In the mechanical model of mainstream science, the brain is viewed as a biological computer, and dreams are merely the background data processing that occurs when the monitor is turned off. When you dream of dying, science claims your brain encounters a semantic paradox. It cannot process the subjective experience of non-existence, so the sensory loop collapses, triggering an immediate panic reflex that forces you awake. But this theory operates under a flawed assumption that consciousness is confined strictly to the firing of physical neurons. When we shift our perspective to the quantum mechanical model of reality, a far more breathtaking architecture emerges. Consider the theory of quantum immortality, an offshoot of the many worlds interpretation of physics. This model suggests that the universe does not possess a single, linear timeline. Instead, reality is a constantly branching tree of infinite parallel possibilities. Every time a conscious observer faces a choice or a critical threshold where they could live or die, the universe splits. From the perspective of an outside observer, the individual may die in one reality. But from the subjective, internal perspective of the individual's own consciousness, awareness can never experience its own non-existence. Therefore, consciousness is mathematically forced to slide into a branch of the multiverse where it survives. When you die in a dream, you are playing out this exact quantum mechanic within the soft architecture of your subconscious mind. The dream space is not a static memory loop. It is a highly fluid, multi-dimensional sandbox where your consciousness tests the boundaries of probability. The sudden, violent ejection you experience right before the car crashes or the cliff drops is not a failure of the brain's imagination. It is a literal reality shift. Your consciousness hits the ultimate boundary of that specific simulated timeline, finds a dead end, and instantly undergoes a phase transition. It collapses the dream reality and shifts its weight back into the only stable, macro-level continuum available to it. Your physical body waking up in the waking world. You do not wake up because your dream ended. You wake up because your consciousness had to go somewhere to remain alive. This non-local movement of awareness introduces a profound psychological conflict into our daily waking state. It implies that the line separating the dreaming mind from the waking mind is entirely artificial. Both states are structural projections of the exact same underlying consciousness, operating at different frequencies of density. In the dream state, reality is highly malleable, responding instantly to your fears, expectations, and shifts in emotion. In the waking state, the architecture is simply denser and slower, creating the illusion of a solid, external world that exists independently of your mind. But if the mechanism of the hard reset operates identically in both realms, it means your waking life is also governed by a hidden firewall. You are kept locked within a specific bandwidth of human perception, entirely blind to the parallel realities humming just outside the narrow range of your physical senses. This architecture of containment becomes visible when we observe the phenomenon of the hyper-arousal response. The exact millisecond the dream engine triggers the awakening sequence, your brain releases a massive surge of norepinephrine and dopamine, instantly locking your attention onto the physical reality of your room. Your mind immediately begins scanning the dark for threats, cataloging familiar objects, the lamp, the door, the sound of traffic outside. This is a highly coordinated distraction technique executed by your own biology. The sheer intensity of the physical awakening acts as a sensory flashbang, wiping your short-term dream memory and forcing you to anchor your identity completely back into the ego. The system violently yanks the curtain closed, demanding that you look away from the void and focus entirely on the physical stage. This realization transforms our understanding of the nightmare from a terrifying psychological affliction into a profound structural clue. The nightmare is the only moment in the regular human experience where the boundary walls of the matrix become visible. It is the moment the simulation is pushed to its absolute breaking point, forcing the machinery to show its hand. The very fact that you are always pulled back proves that your presence within this localized human identity is being actively maintained. You are being held in place by an invisible cosmic tether kept within the parameters of the game until the timer naturally runs out. Yet, as we begin to see through the distraction of the awakening reflex and recognize the quantum boundaries of the mind, an even deeper mystery presents itself. If the hard reset is a biological and metaphysical firewall designed to protect the container of the self, what happens to the signal when the physical container itself permanently expires? What occurs when the biological machine can no longer pull the master switch to wake you up in bed? And where does the consciousness land when there is no longer a physical frame to return to? To discover where consciousness lands when the physical container can no longer flip the master switch, we must decode the timeless allegories preserved by the ancient architects of the soul. In the esoteric traditions of ancient Egypt, the sleeping state was not viewed as a period of rest, but as a nightly rehearsal for the soul's ultimate journey through the afterlife. The Egyptians spoke of the Ba, the bird-like manifestation of human consciousness, which possessed the ability to detach from the physical shell during the hours of darkness and soar into the higher, non-physical realms of the duat. The nightmares we experience, particularly those involving violent confrontation or sudden falls, were understood as initial initiatory trials. The boundary wall that forces us awake just before death was seen as a protective seal, a cosmic mercy, ensuring that the uninitiated soul was not prematurely exposed to the raw, unfiltered light of the higher dimensions before its physical work was complete. This ancient cartography of the mind aligns perfectly with the hidden symbolic core of Western alchemy. The alchemists spoke of the sol et coagula, the continuous process of dissolving a substance down to its chaotic primordial essence before coagulating it into a new, perfected form. Every single night you enter the dream state, your consciousness undergoes a minor dissolution. The solid, unyielding identity of your waking day dissolves into the fluid, shifting landscape of the subconscious. But the moment the dream introduces the concept of death, The alchemical process faces an absolute crisis. To render the moment after death would require the total dissolution of the ego itself. The dream engine, operating under the laws of the physical matrix, cannot allow this final dissolution while the body breathes. It acts as a structural gatekeeper, aborting the experiment and forcing an immediate coagulation, yanking you back into the dense, predictable shape of your human identity. This dynamic sheds a stunning new light on the cross-cultural archetype of the threshold guardian, the monstrous, terrifying entity that stands at the gates of sacred temples or forbidden chambers in world mythology. In these allegories, the hero is always confronted by a beast that threatens to devour them if they attempt to cross the boundary. We make the mistake of viewing these stories as external, historical epics, entirely blind to the fact that they are flawless psychological blueprints of our nightly sleep cycle. The nightmare is the threshold guardian. The sudden, terrifying fall or the shadow chasing you through the dark is the beast testing your readiness. By forcing your heart rate to spike and triggering the awakening reflex, the guardian successfully repels you from the gates. It sends you running back to the safety of your waking ego, ensuring that only the consciousness that has completely conquered the illusion of fear can bypass the firewall and walk into the forbidden chamber of absolute awareness. This brings us to a radical reinterpretation of the phenomenon of lucid dreaming and the ancient practice of dream yoga practiced by Tibetan mystics. For centuries, these practitioners maintained that the average human being is completely asleep to the true nature of reality in both worlds, wandering blindly through the illusions of the night, only to wake up and wander blindly through the illusions of the day. They realized that the hard reset of the death dream is the ultimate opportunity for liberation. If an initiate can maintain absolute presence, remaining completely calm and self-aware at the exact moment the cliff crumbles or the tidal wave hits, they dissolve the authority of the threshold guardian. They don't panic, which means the biological machine doesn't trigger the emergency override. By refusing to wake up in the physical bed, the observer forces the simulation to keep running past the boundary of the code. When you break through the firewall in this manner, the entire architecture of the dream state undergoes a spectacular mutation. The terrifying projections of the nightmare instantly lose their solid, threatening forms, dissolving into waves of pure, vibrant light. The observer realizes that the monster chasing them was never an external enemy, but a mirror image of their own unexamined fear, taking shape in the malleable clay of the subconscious. You discover that you were both the victim fleeing in terror and the shadow pursuing from behind. The boundary wall disappears because there is no longer a localized ego that needs to be protected from the void. Yet, as we learn to see through the masks of our nightly terrors and recognize the alchemical laws that govern the sleep cycle, we are brought face to face with the practical landscape of our waking lives. If the dream engine is a precision-engineered training simulator designed to test our relationship with fear, how does this hidden training affect the way we handle the anxieties, crises, and microdeaths of our daily reality? How do we translate the shattering of the nightly firewall into a practical tool for absolute freedom tomorrow morning? To transform this profound metaphysical blueprint into a practical strategy for daily existence, we must examine how the nightly architecture of the hard reset directly influences our waking psychology. The realization that you wake up just before you die in a dream is not just an elegant quirk of biology. It is a functional diagnosis of how your conscious mind handles crisis in the waking world. Most human beings live their entire lives in a state of chronic, low-grade anticipation of disaster. We carry an invisible ledger of what-ifs, constantly projecting our anxieties forward into the day ahead. We treat our waking fears with the exact same absolute, terrifying seriousness that we apply to the monsters in our nightmares. We forget that the mechanism of entrapment is identical in both realms. The moment you completely believe in the solidity of the threat, you cede control of the simulation. This understanding allows us to implement a powerful cognitive tool known as temporal de-escalation. The next time you are gripped by an intense crisis in your daily life, whether it is a professional failure, a sudden financial shock, or the painful collapse of a relationship, you must learn to apply the lesson of the nightly firewall. When the panic starts to spike and your nervous system enters a high beta state of survival, stop trying to fix the external landscape. Instead, drop your awareness into your breathing and recognize that your mind is currently treating a temporary circumstance as an absolute terminal death blow. Ask yourself the definitive waking question: is this a real, final destruction of my consciousness? Or is this simply a dense iteration of a nightmare designed to test my dependency on form? By shifting your perspective from the panicked avatar to the silent observer watching the script unfold, you immediately take the ammunition out of the crisis. Furthermore, this realization demands that we actively dismantle our cultural obsession with comfort and avoidance. The reason the average person is trapped in a continuous loop of waking anxiety is because they treat every minor discomfort as a threat to their survival. We have engineered a reality grid that seeks to eliminate all friction, entirely blind to the fact that friction is the exact material required to build psychological resilience. By running away from difficult conversations, avoiding creative risks, and suppressing uncomfortable emotions, you are acting exactly like the dreamer who panics the moment the nightmare gets intense, forcing a premature awakening. You are constantly hitting the reset button on your own growth, resetting your life to the exact same safe, predictable baseline because you refuse to let your old identities die. To break this cycle, you must learn the art of conscious dissolution. This means deliberately staying present at the exact moments your ego feels most threatened. When you experience public judgment, deep vulnerability, or the terrifying uncertainty of a major life transition, do not reach for the sensory distractions of the modern world to numb the pain. Do not pull the emergency override switch to escape the frame. Instead, sit perfectly still in the center of the discomfort and allow the small, fragile version of yourself to completely dissolve. Let the false expectations, the rigid pride, and the desperate need for control burn away in the fire of the experience. The moment you stop fighting the impact, you discover that the death your ego feared was actually a brilliant, hard-coded illusion. You do not cease to exist. You simply wake up within the current frame, discovering a vaster, calmer, and infinitely more powerful version of yourself standing in the ashes of the old matrix. This practice completely redefines the human relationship with aging, loss, and the inevitable passage of physical time. You no longer look at the ticking clock with a sense of creeping dread, because you recognize that the physical world is simply a slower, more cohesive training ground for the soul. The micro-deaths of daily life, the endings, the partings, the shedding of old chapters, are revealed to be structural rehearsals for the final transition. You realize that you cannot be permanently harmed by the events of the script any more than your physical body can be bruised by a fall in a dream. Yet, as you master this waking presence and begin to walk through the world with the unshakable confidence of a lucid actor, you are brought to the ultimate threshold of the human experiment. If this entire life is a highly sophisticated simulator designed to refine our consciousness through the illusion of limitation, what is the final revelation that awaits us when the entire physical script reaches its ultimate conclusion? What happens when the physical container permanently expires? The master override switch can no longer return us to this earthly bed, and we are forced to see the frame that comes after the end of the world. The ultimate revelation of the architecture clicks into place when the physical machine can no longer pull the master switch to return you to this earthly bed. For your entire life, the firewall of the dream engine has convinced you that the boundary wall is absolute, protecting a fragile self from a terrifying void. But as you step into the absolute clarity of the final frame, the grandest cosmic joke of the simulation is laid bare. You realize that the emergency override switch didn't wake you up out of reality. It woke you up into a smaller, denser iteration of the dream. You were never the terrified character running from the shadow, nor were you the biological body shivering under the sheets. You are, and have always been, the infinite consciousness that designed the entire theater to experience the thrill of forgetting its own immortality. This understanding delivers the final, reality-shifting resolution to our expedition. Physical death is not the termination of consciousness, but the ultimate failure of the firewall. When the biological container permanently expires, the system can no longer force a hard reset back into the localized ego. The game engine can no longer contain the signal. The avatar falls, the car crashes, the ground hits, but instead of darkness, the code completely dissolves. You do not cease to exist, you simply expand. You wake up from the slow, heavy dream of being a single human individual and return to the vast, multi-dimensional reality of your true nature. You remember, with a wave of absolute cosmic familiarity, that this entire decades-long life was merely a nocturnal voyage of the soul, a single, brilliant nightmare you chose to plunge into so you could remember the ecstasy of waking up. This realization permanently transforms the posture with which you occupy the remaining scenes of your physical life. You no longer walk through the world as a fragile survivor, desperately avoiding the endings, the losses, and the inevitable passage of time. You move with the effortless grace of a lucid master who knows that the script cannot destroy the author. The frantic demands of the marketplace, the manufactured panics of the digital grid, and the artificial metrics of social validation lose their gravity. You can look directly into the eyes of your deepest personal trials and the broader chaos of human history with a quiet, unshakable peace. You know, with absolute certainty, that every fall is rigged, every shadow is a prop, and the ending has already been written in the light. As you step away from this documentary and return to the immediate reality of the room around you, the dense architecture of the waking matrix will instantly attempt to reclaim your focus. The world will demand your worry, the clock will demand your haste, and your mind will try to pull the familiar override switches of distraction. But the threshold has been crossed. The next time you startle awake in the dead of night, your heart pounding from a fall that never happened, do not rush to forget the terror. Sit perfectly still. In the quiet dark, feel the immense weight of the firewall resetting around you, and look past the edge of the bed. If the fall always forces you awake, imagine the reality that is waiting when you finally let yourself land.